Sometimes life places us in situations that seem impossible to face. The story I'm about to tell you is about a young woman who did everything to protect her mother and ended up diving into something much greater than she could have ever imagined. It's a tale full of sacrifice, fear, and decisions no one should ever have to make. I think you'll feel the weight of every word she shares, as if you were living right there beside her. Good evening, Dom. My name is Luana. I'm 25 years old and I'm from Veracruz. The story I'm going to share happened when I was 19. I'm an only child, raised solely by my mother, who always devoted herself to caring for me and ensuring I had everything I needed. During my last year of school, I started noticing that my mother was hiding something from me. Even though I suspected it for months, I didn't confront her. I thought that if she wasn't saying anything, she must have her reasons. But in recent days, the situation became evident. She was much thinner, eating very little, and her skin looked paler than usual. Sometimes I heard her vomiting, and I even found red stains on her clothes. One evening during dinner, I decided to ask her directly. My concern for her health wouldn't let me pretend everything was fine anymore. My mother, Simone, was terrible at hiding things from me. She said she had consulted a doctor, that everything was under control, and that I didn't need to worry. But somehow, I knew she wasn't telling the truth. The next day, we went together to a neighborhood doctor. He prescribed some medications, but they were expensive, and he also recommended plenty of rest. My mother, who worked as a supermarket cashier and was on her feet all day, refused to take time off. She said the medications were costly and that without her salary, we wouldn't be able to cover the expenses. I, on the other hand, sold candied apples at school, but the money barely helped us make ends meet. I suggested getting a job after school since I was close to finishing high school, but my mother was adamant. No. She said the matter was closed. Still, time went by, and although the medications seemed to work initially, she continued working and neglecting rest. Soon her health worsened again, perhaps even more than before. I heard her spending sleepless nights, struggling with discomfort. Without her knowing, I went to a stationery store near our house and asked for a job. The owner hired me for a part-time shift. It wasn't much money, but it would help with the bills and, most importantly, her medications. One night I heard my mother struggling to breathe. I ran to her room and found her suffocating. Terrified, I called the doctor, who came quickly and managed to stabilize her. "Mom, you mean everything to me. I don't want to lose you. I'll take care of the house and you'll rest until you're better again," I said through tears, holding her hand. I explained that it was just temporary, that she would recover soon, and everything would go back to normal. It was my turn to take care of her, just as she had always taken care of me. I wish I could say things got better, but unfortunately they didn't. Her health continued to decline, and the medications became increasingly expensive. Despite working at the stationery store in the afternoons, selling candied apples in the mornings, and even doing schoolwork for classmates at night, the money was never enough. Out of fear of worrying her, I kept everything a secret. I did everything I could to make sure she didn't know how much I was struggling to support her. Our savings were gone. I was on the verge of despair, crying alone at night, unable to find a way out. Nothing made sense anymore. I thought about dropping out of school, but I was in my last year of high school and couldn't bear the idea of giving up so close to the end. I also considered postponing my college plans, but my mother was getting worse each day, and the options were running out quickly. One afternoon, while working at the stationery store, I overheard two women talking. They were complaining about how money was never enough, and mentioned that being a night escort paid more than working in a company. That conversation stuck in my head. I spent the entire night thinking about it. It wasn't the first time I had heard something like that. Some classmates at school had even joked about it. I started wondering if it was really possible to earn the money we needed that way. Seeing my mother so frail, fighting for her life, was unbearable. The doctor kept insisting that the medications were essential, and I knew that without them, there would be no improvement. A few weeks later, there I was, out on the streets of the city, trying to earn the money we needed. It was a nightmare leaving home in the middle of the night, standing on a corner, and waiting for someone to approach me. I don't want to go into details about how it started or who led me to take that step. All I know is that necessity forced me. I kept telling myself it was temporary, just until I had enough for my mother. When she began questioning where the money was coming from, I lied. I told her that university friends were helping me. Lying hurt, but it was for her. The first few weeks were tough. I hated every second of what I was doing, but my mother wasn't getting better and I couldn't stop. Before leaving the house, I would convince myself that it was almost over, that it would end soon. One night in particular, my mind was far away. The image of my mother growing weaker every day wouldn't leave me. I wasn't paying attention to what was happening around me. Then I noticed a car approaching slowly and stopping beside me. I looked at the driver. He seemed young, maybe in his 30s, but his face carried a deep exhaustion. His unshaven beard, tired eyes, and worried expression were evident. Yet, he smiled at me. "Are you okay?" he asked, surprising me. I hesitated for a few seconds before replying that I was fine and asked how I could help him. In my mind, I already imagined what he was looking for. But unexpectedly, he said he didn't want anything, just to talk. I was suspicious and warned him that even so I would charge for my time. He agreed and offered me nearly triple what I usually asked for. I got into the car. It was a new vehicle, but I only noticed this once I was seated. He asked if there was any specific place I wanted to go. I asked him to stay close to downtown. He parked near a park in a dimly lit area. Everything was silent. The city seemed to be asleep. The man turned off the engine and stared at me. The silence was awkward. I didn't know how to act or interpret what was happening. Suddenly I saw tears starting to fill his eyes. In moments he was crying openly, tears streaming down his face while I remained speechless. "I can't take it anymore. I'm lost and have no way out," he said, almost whispering. I stayed silent, just listening. He looked at me with his eyes swollen from crying so much. "He won't leave me alone. He'll never leave me alone," he continued, sobbing. "Who are you talking about?" I asked hesitantly. He didn't answer. He just remained silent, as if the words were too heavy to speak. I had ambition. I wanted money. I wanted everything. I believed it would be simple, that he would give me what I needed. I made the biggest mistake of my life. Now he's after me. I can't even sleep. His words began to unsettle me. There was something in his voice that gave me chills. I thought that perhaps he owed money to someone dangerous or was involved with the police. "I just want my old life back, peaceful with the people I love. I have everything money can buy, but none of it makes sense." He cried uncontrollably. "Honestly, I don't understand what you're saying. I'm sorry," I murmured. The man stared straight ahead as if he were seeing something. In front of us, there were only the shadows of trees swaying in the wind. "Something is following me, but it's not a person. It's something that isn't human. I made a pact with a demon." My mind immediately thought that he might be under the influence of drugs. None of it seemed real. He kept his eyes fixed on a nearby tree, as if something was there. I wanted money, a life full of luxury. I don't know how he found me, but he showed up and offered me everything. Now he's everywhere, laughing at me. That ironic smile, as if he knows I belong to him. I'm scared because I know he won't leave me alone. I wanted to get out of there. He seemed completely convinced of what he was saying. His hands trembled, and his voice was filled with despair. Right now he's there, under that tree, looking at me. I looked in the direction he pointed, but all I saw were branches and shadows. At night I feel his breath beside me. He laughs, whispers in a language I don't understand. I'm sure he wants to take me. I'm doomed. He cried like a scared child, and I felt increasingly nervous, looking around for any signs of movement. There was no one else there but us. He wiped his tears, looked forward, and asked where that thing was, since it seemed to have disappeared. He looked around, agitated, while I did the same, even though nothing had changed. Suddenly a chill ran down my spine. I turned instinctively toward the back seat and saw a figure sitting there. It was a tall man dressed in black. His face was hidden in shadow, but there was something in the outline that suggested a smile. My body froze for a second before I quickly opened the car door. There had been no one else there when I got in. I was sure of it. My heart raced. I grabbed my bag and got out, walking quickly away from the man. He remained in the car, motionless, just looking at me with red, tear-filled eyes. I made it to the corner, where I managed to catch a taxi. I got in hurriedly and asked to be taken home. On the way back home, my mind was racing. How had that figure gotten into the car? How could it so closely resemble what the man had described, the figure that was haunting and terrorizing him? For a few days, I tried to convince myself that it was all just my imagination, perhaps a result of fear and nervousness. It couldn't be real. However, I barely had time to reflect on it. My mother was still sick, and taking care of her occupied almost all of my thoughts. I used to ask clients to drop me off near the city center. I avoided being dropped off near my house as much as possible to avoid raising suspicions or gossip among the neighbors. That night, however, it was almost 2 a.m. and we were relatively close. I asked to be dropped off a few blocks from my address. I got out in front of an apartment complex and, exhausted, I just wanted to get home quickly. I checked the GPS and saw that I still had about a 30-minute walk. I thought I was closer. I considered catching a taxi, but the first two I tried were already occupied. I kept walking. The silence of the deserted streets at that hour made me nervous. In the distance, I saw a couple coming from the other side of the sidewalk, which gave me a brief sense of security. I took the opportunity to pull out my phone and send a message to a friend who knew about my nighttime routine. I always shared my location or a note, just in case something happened. A few minutes later, I heard someone saying good evening to me. I looked up from my phone and saw, across the street, a man walking toward me. He was tall, dressed in black, and wearing an old hat. "Good evening," he repeated in a strange, high-pitched, drawling voice. "Good evening," I replied quickly, uninterested, and kept walking. For some reason, that man seemed familiar to me. I looked at my phone to check the time. 2:30 a.m. I crossed the street to get away, but soon I heard footsteps behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, now on the same side of the sidewalk. He seemed strange. His clothes were oversized for his thin frame, worn out, and he limped, dragging one of his feet. "Good evening," he said again, now in a mocking tone. I pretended not to hear and quickened my pace. I saw a taxi approaching and raised my hand, but it passed by, already occupied. Everything around me seemed enveloped in absolute silence. The sound of the man dragging his feet was clear even from a distance. I turned to look one more time, and he was closer. My first thought was that he might be dangerous, perhaps planning to attack me. I prepared the pepper spray I carried in my jacket. "I can help your mother," he said, followed by a laugh. A chill ran through my body. How did he know about my mother? I stopped suddenly and turned to face him. He was standing near a streetlight, but the shadow covered his face. Still, I could tell he was smiling. "I can heal her," he said again, pointing to himself with a finger. I tried to ignore him, but he kept insisting. Every step I took, he followed, repeating the same phrase. "I can heal her." My irritation and nervousness grew. I looked at my phone to confirm that my location had already been sent to my friend. The message was there. "I know she's very sick. If you don't do something soon, she's going to die." I felt my legs trembling. His words were firm, spoken with a frightening conviction, and a shiver ran down my spine. "How do you know that?" I asked, stopping again and turning to face him. My hand gripped the pepper spray tightly. He remained standing at a distance, but his presence was suffocating. He was very tall and thin, with pale skin and unnaturally long hands. His eyes, even in the shadows, had a shine that didn't seem human. "Stop following me, I'm not alone," I said loudly, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't react. He remained still, smiling with that wide, mocking grin that seemed to cut through the shadows. His body didn't move, rigid like a statue. Without waiting any longer, I turned my back and began walking quickly. I could still hear his footsteps, but then came a guttural sound, almost inhuman, that made me shudder. It was hard to describe, but it sounded like a growl, as if someone were trying to speak but couldn't. My body froze, my legs seemed unresponsive, and a knot tightened in my throat. "Give me what I ask for, and I will heal her," he repeated, followed by those same disturbing sounds. For a moment I thought he was choking, but then came the laughter, full of mockery. The sound of his footsteps echoed closer and closer. I didn't dare look back. His presence was almost tangible, as if the air around me grew denser. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and dialed my friend's number. Without waiting, I started running. My only thought was to get home. I didn't know what that thing wanted from me, but the fear of it following me to my door was unbearable. As I ran, I heard a scream that sounded like a lament, a howl echoing through the deserted street. That's when the memory hit me. It was the same man I had seen in the back seat of the car that night. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I ran faster, tears streaming down my face. The story of the pact the man in the car had told made even more sense now. I was screaming, begging him to leave me alone, to please go away. The phone screen showed that my friend wasn't answering. She was probably asleep. Finally, I recognized the streets. I was close to home, but the panic didn't subside. I looked over my shoulder and screamed. He was closer. His movements were erratic, staggering, as if he had difficulty walking. His hands, deformed, tried to balance themselves as his feet dragged along the ground. My desperation took over. I screamed for help, hoping someone would appear, that a light would turn on in one of the houses. Turning the last corner, I saw a group of men sitting on the sidewalk, drinking. As soon as they saw me, they stood up alarmed. "Help me, please, someone is following me," I pleaded, my voice trembling. One of the men walked to the corner where I had come from, but returned, saying there was no one there. I insisted, almost screaming, that yes, there was a tall man, dressed in black, who had been following me for several minutes. How was it possible they hadn't heard those horrible screams? Those laments still echoed in my mind. The other two also went to check, but found nothing. There was no one. They stared at me, scared, while I cried, trembling. Deep down, I was sure that whatever had been following me wasn't human. It wasn't normal. The sounds it made, its movements, the way it seemed to watch me. Everything was wrong. They tried to calm me, but my eyes remained fixed on the corner, expecting that figure to reappear with the same mocking smile. In the end, they insisted on walking me home. In other circumstances, I would never have accepted, but the fear was so great that I couldn't imagine walking alone. When I arrived, I locked myself in my room. I didn't want my mother to hear me crying, so I buried my face in the pillow. My body still trembled at the memory of that thing's voice and everything it had said. The way it spoke was disturbing, as if it had known me for years. What terrified me the most were the words about my mother, the dark warnings about what might happen in the coming days. I stayed up all night. At 7 in the morning, I got up to make coffee. When I went into my mother's room, she looked at me worriedly and asked if I was okay, mentioning that I looked paler than usual. I lied, saying I was fine, but I knew she could tell it wasn't true. I stopped going out at night for about a week, but soon the need for money forced me back. The fear was always with me. In the first few days, my mind played tricks on me, making me imagine that man at every corner. I didn't sleep well and needed to sleep with the lights on. The slightest noise put me on alert. I began to hate being alone, and on many nights, I ended up sleeping in my mother's room. Although the money helped a lot, my mother showed no signs of improvement. I helped her bathe, get dressed, and eat. She spent the day in her room, preferring to rest. Her breathing at night was heavy, and its sound disturbed me. I couldn't leave her alone, not to work, not to go to school. Her image stayed in my mind every second. One day I came home from school exhausted. The year was almost over, but the teachers overwhelmed us with projects and assignments. I entered my mother's room to check on her. Fortunately, she seemed stable. I sat next to her on the bed and began telling her about my day. Suddenly, she looked at me in a strange way. "What's wrong, Mom?" I asked. "I thought you didn't go to school today." "But I did," I replied, confused. "I even came in here this morning to give you a kiss before leaving." She smiled as if finding it amusing and said, "Then who was the person who spent the entire morning here with me?" I didn't understand. "Mom, I was at school all day," I said, trying to sound firm. "That's impossible, dear. You came in here a couple of times to ask if I needed anything. I left the door open and saw you walking down the hallway several times. I'm sure it was you. Who else could it be?" I couldn't make sense of it. It was impossible that it had been me. I remained silent for a few moments, trying to find an explanation. The first thing that came to mind was that my mother might be hallucinating because of her illness. I tried to stay calm. "It's okay, Mom, don't worry. Come on, let's get you a bath." I got up and extended my hand to help her, but she seemed confused. "Honey, I already took a bath this morning. Do I need another one?" I asked if she had done it alone, since it was dangerous given her frail condition. But she insisted that it had been me who helped her. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't remember anything she was talking about, and it was impossible since I had spent the morning at school. In the following days, I began to feel uncomfortable at home. My mother continued to say that she spoke with me or saw me walking down the hallways. Until then, I tried to attribute it to her illness. I even texted the doctor asking if it was normal for her to imagine things. I was very worried. One night, while doing schoolwork in the kitchen with all the lights in the house turned off except for the one at the table where I was studying, I began to fight off sleep. Suddenly, I felt a hand rest on my shoulder. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. I went to my mother's room and found her sleeping soundly. Maybe it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. I went back to the study table, leaving her door open. A short time later, I heard footsteps coming from inside the house. I stopped what I was doing to listen. They were clearly footsteps, but there was something strange about the sound, as if the person were dragging their feet. I got up slowly and walked down the hallway toward my mother's room. Then I saw, at the end of the hallway, a silhouette pass in front of me. It was a tall, dark figure dragging one leg. A knot tightened in my throat and my legs felt paralyzed. I knew exactly what I was seeing, the same thing that had followed me on the street. The figure disappeared into one of the rooms. Still gripped by fear, I forced my legs to move. I walked to the room where the figure had gone and turned on the light. It was empty. Desperate, I ran to the end of the hallway and entered my mother's room. She was still asleep. I quickly closed the door and sat next to her on the bed. My heart raced, my hands trembled, and my breathing came in short gasps. I didn't know what was happening or why it seemed to be following me. Helplessness overtook me. Tears streamed down my face, but I didn't want to wake her up. I lay down next to my mother and stayed there until morning. The energy in the house felt increasingly heavy. I constantly felt restless. My mother continued to report things that I did for her, but that I never did. She said I brushed her hair, brought her water, helped her with her medications. The way she described everything with so much conviction terrified me. According to her, I looked at her intently while smiling. One afternoon when I came back from school, my mother asked me what was wrong with my foot because she said she saw me limping. My blood ran cold. I think she noticed my reaction because she commented that I had turned very pale. To avoid alarming her, I lied. "It's nothing, Mom, I just hurt my toe, don't worry." That's when the truth hit me like a shock. That silhouette was impersonating me. It was the one talking to my mother. There was no other explanation. This terrified me. Knowing that this being was so close to her, touching her, observing her, left me completely shaken. I didn't know what it was, how strong it was, or why it had chosen to follow me. On the nights I went out to work, I searched for the man from the first night, the one who gave me a ride. I never saw him again. I wondered if he had been taken by that thing, if he had gone mad or simply disappeared. But the fear of leaving my mother alone began to keep me at home. Even though I needed the money, something inside me told me I couldn't risk it. Despair consumed me. I constantly felt watched, as if that being was never far away, even when I was in my mother's room. And worst of all, she wasn't getting better. She was becoming weaker, eating almost nothing while red spots appeared on her body. I was on the brink of madness, feeling abandoned by everything and everyone, even God. One early morning I woke up with a start, as if something heavy had pressed down on my chest. I sat up in bed, panting, and looked at my mother beside me. She was sleeping, but her breathing was so faint it scared me. The idea of needing to hospitalize her crossed my mind more and more. I went to the kitchen to get some water, as my mouth was drier than ever. When I returned and opened the bedroom door, I froze. There he was, that tall man, standing in front of the bed, staring intently at my mother. His posture was strange, with his fingers spread wide and his body tilted in an unnatural way. Slowly he turned his face toward me, and a wide smile appeared in the darkness. His eyes gleamed as if he were enjoying my terror. Seeing that being so close to her with his fingers mere inches from touching her was enough for something inside me to snap. I knew in that moment that he was the reason she was so debilitated. He wanted to take her. I ran to her and hugged her with all my strength. With that thin, unsettling voice, he repeated that he could heal her, that he could save her if I wanted. But I couldn't bear to hear it. I screamed, telling him I didn't need anything from him, that he wouldn't take her. My mother was everything I had. My scream came out full of hatred, making it clear that I would fight to the end. The words were directed straight at him, as a challenge. While holding my mother tightly against me, tears streamed down my face like a helpless child. And it was there in that moment that I realized just how alone I felt. Suddenly, I felt her arms hugging me back. She had woken up and little by little responded to my embrace, covering my face with kisses. I cried uncontrollably, and so did she. We trembled together, connected by deep fear and pain. Don't leave me, I thought, holding her with everything I had. I can't be alone. But the days that followed only brought more suffering. My mother deteriorated further, and I had to hospitalize her. Her breathing no longer allowed her to stay at home. That time was one of the most difficult periods of my life. I dropped out of school and no longer went out to the streets at night. Even so, I felt that thing was still around. At the hospital, I sometimes saw its shadow in the distance or felt that uncomfortable presence, but it no longer came near me. Since that night in the bedroom, it hadn't tried to make contact again. Today, I believe it wanted to convince me to make a pact, but I understood that accepting would mean losing everything anyway, and as difficult as it was, I wouldn't give in. My classmates and teachers found out that my mother was in the ICU and tried to help me. Some provided financial support, others offered words of comfort. I was grateful, but inside I felt empty. It was unbearable to see her lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by wires and machines. One night, while dozing in the hospital waiting room, I woke up startled. They didn't allow me to sleep in her room, so I spent the nights there, waiting in case of an emergency. The room had a glass door that opened to a long corridor filled with rooms. When I lifted my gaze, I saw that tall man standing at the end of the hallway, looking directly at me. I tried to look away, but every time I glanced back, he remained there, motionless, just watching me. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore him, but I started hearing whispers, as if he was speaking inside my head. It was a suffocating feeling. Suddenly, a voice called out to me, pulling me out of that trance. I quickly opened my eyes, startled. It was my mother's doctor, who looked at me with a serious expression. At that moment, I knew exactly what had happened. She was gone. The doctor explained that it was a cardiac arrest. Her body couldn't hold on, and there was nothing more they could do. Something inside me broke. That night, I couldn't even cry. My brain seemed incapable of processing the news. I sat in the waiting room for a long time, clinging to the hope that it was a lie. But the reality was crushing. My mother was no longer with me. Remembering that time is still very difficult. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if I had accepted that thing's pact. Would I have my mother back? Or would I end up like that man in the car, trapped in endless torment? These are questions that will never have answers, but they still linger in my mind. Since that night at the hospital, I've never seen that being again. It seems to have vanished, simply leaving me in peace. I finished high school but didn't attend the graduation ceremony. Many people tried to reach out to console me, but I was tired of everything and everyone. I felt angry at the world, angry at life. I did everything I could to save her, tried every way possible to keep her with me, but nothing was enough. In the end, I lost the person I loved most. I miss her every day, but I find comfort in thinking that she's finally resting, free from suffering. Before bed, I always pray for her. I'm certain that in some way she also prays for me. And I wish I could have done more, shown her even more how much I loved her. Now, all I can do is visit her, bring flowers, and spend hours talking to her, sharing my thoughts and life. I like to believe that she listens to me, that she still watches over me, and that every night she hugs me before I fall asleep, just as she did when I was little. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get the latest stories. Your presence means a lot, and your support is essential. All right, let's keep going. I am from the city of Guadalajara, Mexico. I prefer not to mention the name or exact location of the place where everything happened, but I can say it is near a church, in the surroundings of Parque Revolucion. I have two reasons for keeping the location anonymous. First, because the incident is relatively recent. Second, because I still work there. When the pandemic began to ease and the streets became less crowded, I returned to working the afternoon shift at an OXXO near my house. On the day everything happened, I was with a co-worker who was about the same age as me. We were both 26. It was a clear and sunny afternoon. The store was quiet, with only a few customers coming in or passing by on the street. It was a Wednesday, around 4 in the afternoon. My co-worker and I were at the register, chatting. He was more than just a co-worker, he was a friend. Suddenly, we both looked up at the same time because we heard a child's voice. Something felt strange because we didn't hear the doorbell, which always rings when someone enters. We quickly stood up but didn't see anyone, only a man standing with his back to us in the bread and pastries aisle. The man had very short, poorly trimmed hair and was dressed like someone experiencing homelessness. There was no sign of the supposed little girl whose voice we had heard. My co-worker, curious, started to step out from behind the register, perhaps to look for her. Then we heard the clear voice of a child again, apparently a girl about 6 or 7 years old, saying, "Where is the step?" The voice was coming exactly from the aisle where the man was standing, motionless, but no child was visible. "Good afternoon, is the girl with you?" my co-worker asked. At that moment I thought he had already seen the child, but he whispered to me, "Did you see her? I've only heard the voice so far." I replied, "I haven't seen anyone either. Maybe she's hiding behind him." I decided to approach from the other aisle so as not to confront him directly from behind. As I walked, I noticed that the man moved slightly to the side, but continued to face away from us. My co-worker, from a distance, tried leaning to the sides to get a better view, but there was a promotional poster partially blocking his line of sight. It was as if the man knew exactly where he was and was using the poster as an intentional barrier. Meanwhile, he wasn't answering any questions and remained still. We heard the girl's voice again, insisting that the step was no longer there. The voice seemed so close that it was impossible to ignore. Either she was hiding behind him or there was no logical explanation. I kept walking down the aisle, heading to the back near the freezers where the sodas were, trying to figure out the mystery. The situation was becoming increasingly strange. When I finally got a better look at him, he turned around and started staring intently at my co-worker at the register. Everything happened very quickly. The instant he made this move, we heard the girl's voice again saying, "Goodbye." The problem was that even then, we didn't see anyone else there, only the man. Suddenly, he ran out of the store at an incredible speed, as if he wasn't even touching the ground. At that moment, the doorbell finally rang. When I looked at the register, my co-worker was on the floor, completely shaken. I had no idea why he was so disturbed. I asked if he needed help, if he was okay, and what he said left me speechless. That man was actually a girl. I froze. I asked him to repeat himself, trying to understand, and he, visibly scared, explained. The man, who seemed to be about 5'7", had the face and voice of a girl. He started crying. I called our supervisor, who, because of the pandemic, was still keeping a close eye on everything at all times. He answered immediately. I explained that a mentally disturbed person had entered the store and scared us. The supervisor said he would check the cameras and, noticing that my co-worker wasn't well, informed us that he would come to us as soon as possible. While we waited, I tried to distract my friend, who kept repeating that the figure, apparently male, had spoken like a child and, according to him, even had the face of a little girl. We kept the conversation on other topics, attended to the few customers who came in, and 2 hours later, the supervisor arrived. He seemed serious. He told us he had analyzed the camera footage, but to our astonishment, there was absolutely no one there besides the two of us. Everything we described was on the footage. Us standing up, me walking down the aisles, but there was no sign of another person. Neither the man nor any child. The supervisor was visibly concerned, which made us even more confused. At that moment, the weight of what we had experienced really started to sink in. Despite everything, my co-worker and I decided to continue working there. The supervisor even offered a transfer to another location, but we chose to stay together for a few more months. Eventually, he went back to school and I stayed at the store. Thank God I never experienced anything similar again. To this day, I can't explain what kind of thing appeared there. I'm only certain of one thing. Whatever it was, it didn't seem like anything good. I'd like to take this moment to share something very strange and unsettling that I experienced during my time as a police officer. Today I can speak about it calmly, without fear, because back then, while I was still on duty, discussing such cases was risky. If a superior disapproved of this kind of talk, it could harm your retirement, even cancel it. But now, with so many years of retirement behind me, I feel comfortable sharing and putting my name to this story. I have the freedom to tell it. If my memory serves me right, this happened between 1990 and 1991. I remember it was January, a quieter period with fewer cases to attend to. One of those nights, my team and I were in Cosamaloapan, Veracruz, Mexico, when we received a call from the northern part of the city. We drove there, taking about 15 to 20 minutes, until we reached a village called Chicalpextl. From there, we followed a dirt road surrounded by vegetation and full of mud, but still well-defined, until we found a small isolated house from which the call for help had been made. The call came from a family asking for help because someone outside the house was threatening them. It was something that had been happening for several nights. We couldn't wait for the situation to escalate, so we quickly went there. As soon as we arrived, we got out of the car and saw a couple, appearing to be between 45 and 50 years old, and an older woman, probably 70 or 75. It was the older woman who opened the gate and practically ran toward us, visibly distressed. She said he was in the yard and wanted to take her, insisting that we listen to something. We entered the property cautiously because the couple's behavior seemed much calmer than the older woman's, which puzzled us. Her daughter tried to calm her, holding her by the shoulders and saying that our presence would resolve everything. The son-in-law, on the other hand, spoke to us in a low tone. We didn't know how to explain this over the phone. We hadn't seen what my mother-in-law was talking about until today. And even if we tried to describe it, you wouldn't believe us. That's why we asked you to come and see it with your own eyes. Hearing that, my colleague and I exchanged confused glances. What could this mystery be? We followed the man to the backyard as he walked at a steady pace. Then we heard twice a male voice shouting the name Concepcion. We didn't know who this man was or if he was the one we were looking for, since we hadn't seen anyone yet. The man guiding us stopped and pointed to a corner of the property. We looked in the indicated direction but saw nothing at first. To the right, there was a path leading to a corral, where we assumed the animals were sleeping. To the left, in the corner of the yard, we only saw some rocking chairs, a shovel, a fence, and a goat. It was a large black animal with some white spots, clearly a male given its size. Before we had time to ask anything, we heard that voice again shouting, "Concepcion!" That's exactly why we asked you to come. That goat you're looking at died 3 days ago. Only today did we understand what my mother-in-law had been complaining about, the man said. We were stunned. I thought it might be a prank, perhaps even a trap. But the serious look and nervousness of the man as he stared at the animal made me realize it didn't seem like a joke. The goat, in turn, was also staring directly at us while shouting the name Concepcion in a deep voice, similar to that of an elderly man. The atmosphere grew heavy, and we realized the situation was stranger than we had imagined. I never met the man, but my wife and my mother-in-law said this voice is from her deceased father. By the way, my mother-in-law's name is Concepcion, he continued. My colleague and I were completely shocked. Still, I clung to the possibility that it was some kind of hoax. How could this be real? I asked the man directly if they were staging some kind of trick. I warned him that if that were the case, they could get into trouble. He replied, visibly offended, "Sir, do you really think I would joke about something like this? I'm begging you to shoot this thing. This is no longer an animal. This goat, I assure you, died 3 days ago. We buried it. I have no idea why it's standing or doing this. Please, help us." Before we could decide anything, the goat turned its face toward us. What happened next is something I will never forget. It laughed. Yes, it laughed. It was a mocking laugh, distinctly human, like that of an older man. There was no other sound around. The silence made everything more unsettling, and we could hear every detail of that laugh. The animal even moved its mouth, mocking us. Then it began jumping from one side to the other until it fell to the ground. The man ran toward it, and we followed close behind. As we approached, we realized the goat no longer had eyes. Its body, upon closer inspection, clearly looked like that of an animal that had been dead for days. Still, there it was, moving just moments before. We carried the body out of the property to an area where there was a well, some old furniture, and debris. The man explained that he would take his mother-in-law to her sister's house for a few days until everyone calmed down. He thanked us for being there, saying it was a relief to know that someone else had witnessed it and that they no longer felt crazy. My colleague and I were so shaken that we spent the rest of the night talking about what we had seen. Fear and disbelief consumed us. However, we decided that the official report would only state that we dealt with a dispute between drunken neighbors. Nothing more. There was no way to report something as unbelievable as a dead goat doing all of that. Years have passed, but every detail of that night remains vivid in my memory. After that, I never looked at goats the same way again. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to leave a like. It really makes a difference. Okay, let's continue. My name is Deborah Chavez. I'm from Peru, and this is my story. And perhaps because I was so young at the time, many things escaped me, and in a way, that was a relief. I'm not sure. Even so, it's not as if my memory is entirely innocent. It was in 2004 when my father one morning asked me to get ready. Mom was at work and he had a rare day off. I didn't even question it. I just got dressed. I was only 10 years old, but this memory is etched in detail because it's impossible to forget what happened. We got into the car, and he only said that we were going to one of my grandmother's houses. It was a grandmother I barely saw, as my father was the most distant of the siblings, although he maintained a good relationship with his parents. My grandfather had passed away long ago, and I hardly had any memories of him. That day, we were going to see my grandmother. The house was in Arequipa. Those familiar with the area might know what I mean. On one of those narrow streets in Gomez Sanchez, where barely two cars can pass side by side. I had never been there. As soon as we entered, my father explained that we needed to retrieve some documents. The house had few belongings, old furniture, display cabinets full of china. The air there had that smell of aged pages from forgotten books. I stayed downstairs, admiring the objects inside one of the display cabinets. Small porcelain figures caught my attention. Tiny soldiers, little dolls, things that looked like they belonged in a Christmas village. Meanwhile, my father was upstairs, rummaging through drawers, searching for something. That's when I heard noises coming from the kitchen, like someone handling plates and cups. It couldn't have been my father, as I could still hear the sound of drawers being opened upstairs. He also hadn't mentioned anyone else being in the house, but I figured maybe my grandmother had shown up without us noticing. I walked down a narrow hallway that led to the kitchen, an area we hadn't explored when we arrived. When I reached the kitchen door, the light coming through two large windows illuminated everything. I saw my grandmother on the floor, kneeling near the legs of a table in the center of the room. Her hair, a mix of gray and blonde, was disheveled. I'd always thought she looked pale, but that day she seemed even more so. Her thin, bony hands caught my attention, but I couldn't interpret what that meant. It only struck me as odd to see her in that position, as I had never seen her struggle to move before. I called out to her, "Tita!" When she heard my voice, she stopped and, without moving from where she was, turned her face toward me. She was still between the legs of the table. What I saw there has never left my memory. For a child, everything seems confusing, and today, knowing what I know, it makes even less sense. Her face was different. Her bones were very prominent, her skin stretched like paper, her mouth wide open with not a single tooth. But what left me stunned were her eyes, which seemed too large, almost bulging. To me, at the time, it seemed like people's eyes could grow a lot. It was my father who pulled me out of that situation. I vividly remember the moment he arrived behind me, letting out that deep sigh we give when something truly scares us. Without saying a word, he picked me up in his arms and ran out, locking the house in a hurry before putting me in the car. Inside, he desperately searched for the inhaler in the glove compartment, visibly shaken and struggling to breathe. I asked, confused, "Dad, why is Grandma like that? Why did we run away without helping her?" He, still catching his breath, only said that she was sick, that I didn't need to worry, and that it was just a scare. But I couldn't understand why we weren't going back to help her. Even so, I trusted that he knew what he was doing. After all, my father always had a close and affectionate relationship with my grandmother. A few weeks later, while we were in the car, I heard my mother ask if they had sold that house. My father confirmed that they had. Then, curious, I asked about my grandmother. They exchanged glances with a sadness I couldn't decipher at the time and said that she had passed away. There was no funeral, and that deeply upset me. Over time, other questions arose, but they don't fit here. As an adult, in a moment of courage, I asked my father about that day in the kitchen. He grew very serious, extremely serious, and revealed, "On that day we went to the house because of the 3 houses my grandparents had left as inheritance. That one belonged to him. However, my grandmother had already been dead for a week. What we saw," my father explained, "no matter how much it looked like your grandmother, it wasn't her." He assured me that only he had the key to the house and that no one else could enter. Nothing had been stolen, nothing was out of place. But even so, he decided to sell the house. He didn't want to risk seeing whatever that was again. I still get chills just remembering. I can't erase from my memory the look of that thing that seemed like my grandmother. And above all, I never stopped thinking about what might have happened if my father hadn't arrived at that exact moment. When we were kids, my siblings, my parents, and I lived in my grandparents' house in a remote area of Pijijiapan, Mexico. It was a small village, which I believe was called Armando Salinas. I'm going to share something that might seem unbelievable to many. This happened in the 1980s, when my youngest brother was 6 years old, the middle one was 8, and I had just turned 10. At that time, while my parents were at work, it was common for us to go out and play on our own. The area was isolated, with only a few houses nearby, so no one saw a problem with letting kids explore, as long as we didn't wander too far. However, at the beginning of Holy Week, something strange happened. For the first time, our grandparents forbade us from going out early to play. They simply said that my grandfather needed help, which was odd, as we were too young to be of any real help. And so, a week passed with daily excuses, leaving us bored and unable to understand why we were stuck inside during our vacation. Another justification they gave was that the village was deserted and it would be dangerous for us to go out since there wouldn't be anyone around to look after us. We reluctantly accepted this explanation until the 4th day, when everything changed during a visit from one of my aunts. She came with my cousin, who was the same age as me. While the adults chatted and prepared dinner, we seized the moment of distraction to sneak out and run around the village. We decided to go to the school and come back. It was a short distance, something like 5 to 7 minutes, but the area around the school was completely deserted, especially since it was vacation time. When we got there, the sun was setting, but there was still enough light. We ran around carefree until my cousin screamed in terror and took off running back home. I looked in the direction he pointed and saw next to the school, in an abandoned fenced lot, something I would never forget. Standing there was a man. I grabbed my brothers by the hand, yelled for us to run back, and didn't stop until we reached home. My cousin was already there, crying, surrounded by my grandparents, who were scolding us anxiously for leaving without permission. "It was Jesus Christ," he said through tears. "He scared us." I confirmed, saying that I had seen him too. The man was about 15 meters away and looked exactly like the images and statues of Jesus we were used to seeing. Long hair, wearing only a cloth around his waist with marks on his hands, and a deeply sorrowful expression. I noticed that he was making a gesture, as if beckoning us to come to him. The wounds on his hands and face were clearly visible, but he wasn't wearing the crown of thorns. His body had a grayish tone. I didn't notice if his feet were wounded because I didn't look down at them. But what I did see was enough to leave me speechless. Instead of saying we were mistaken, my grandparents reacted with irritation. They said that was exactly why they didn't want us going out, explaining that what we saw was not Jesus Christ. They claimed that during Holy Week many things appeared pretending to be him with the intention of luring people away. They insisted we had to obey them because they had reasons to protect us. As I grew older, I started avoiding looking at any image of Jesus. The memory of that man, so similar to the representations we know, was both inevitable and unsettling. In that village, there were no Passion Play reenactments or Holy Week dramatizations, so it was unlikely that it was someone in costume. Over the years, my grandparents confirmed the seriousness of what they had said back then. They told us they always believed our story, even though they had never seen anything similar themselves, as they avoided going out during those dates. However, stories like ours were known among the villagers, always happening during Holy Week. My name is Gabriela, and a few years ago I worked with an older cousin at the famous Chapultepec forest in Mexico. She owned a stand that had been passed down in the family, and since I was unemployed at the time, she asked me to help her for a while. We sold sweets, snacks, bottled water, and juices. Although things have changed since then, I remember that back then, vendors were allowed to stay in the park even after all the visitors had left. We were always among the last to leave. It wasn't that we liked to extend the day, but on weekends or during holidays, when the park was crowded, we made the most of every minute to sell to those leaving the park at the end of the day. This way, we increased our sales and my uncles gave us a little extra money. That's why I can't say for sure if it was already 6:30 or 7 in the evening when we were still there. It was winter, the sky was already dark, and only a few vendors remained. We knew the guard assigned to that area, so he would usually wait for us patiently. As soon as we closed the stand, we would make a quick stop at the restroom before leaving. That day we went into the restroom together. I finished first and went outside to wait for my cousin. While I was standing there alone, I saw a young man, who seemed to be about 25 or 26 years old, appear around the corner of the restroom, motioning for me to come closer. A chill ran down my spine and I stayed where I was. Who was he? He didn't look like a vendor or anyone I recognized from the park. He had a sad expression as if he was about to cry, which intrigued me. I took a few hesitant steps in his direction, keeping a distance of about 7 meters, and asked loudly if he needed help. It was strange because there was nothing in that direction, no men's restroom, no buildings, just more trees and vegetation. As I slowly approached, I heard a low sound coming from his mouth, something like, I thought he might not be able to speak. I was almost close enough when my cousin came out of the restroom. I explained what I had seen and she saw him too. He was still making gestures for us to come closer and emitting that sound. She suggested, "I don't know who he is, but maybe he needs help. Where's the guard? Do you think he could handle it?" No. We looked around for the guard but couldn't find him. Then my cousin asked me, "Should we go up to him?" Looking back now, I see how reckless that decision was. It was already dark and we were alone and vulnerable. But at the time, we decided to move forward. What happened next was so terrifying that even now, I'm not sure if we would have acted differently. As we walked toward the young man, we noticed that he started backing away, disappearing behind the restrooms. We could clearly hear his footsteps on dry leaves, even though we couldn't see him. We thought he might have fled into the forest, but shortly after we heard the footsteps again, this time closer, near a tree. We looked around, but there was no one in sight. What came next might be hard to believe. Our uncles didn't believe us, and I don't know if you, hearing this story, will believe it either. But I swear that we both saw it that night. On the ground at the base of that tree near the restroom, something appeared that left us paralyzed. A face. It was as if someone's face was emerging from the soil, with their eyes closed but their mouth moving without making any sound. The terror was so overwhelming that we couldn't even tell if it was the same person calling us earlier, or if it was a man or a woman. The only thing we did was run. We ran away screaming in fear. A few meters ahead we found the guard, who was already running toward us, alarmed by our screams. We told him what we had seen. To our surprise, he believed us, unlike our family. He said, "You'd better leave earlier and not pay attention to anyone at this hour. By now, only familiar faces should be around here. Bad things happen in the forest at night. The guard added something I'll never forget. The dead come out to wander at night in the park. After that, I kept helping my cousin for a few more weeks, but we changed our habits. We never stayed until dark again. We left along with the public and completely avoided that restroom. It was a terrifying experience that deeply marked our lives. I spent only a few months in Mexico City for work, which didn't give me enough time to familiarize myself with the metro system, its connections and lines. I only used the ones that were necessary, and only when I truly needed to. However, even with those few experiences, something happened that still leaves me perplexed to this day. It was so striking that I decided to avoid the metro for the remainder of my time in the city. I know it may sound unbelievable, and I don't blame anyone who doubts me. After all, even people close to me question what I recount. But there's something that confirms to me that it wasn't a delusion or my imagination. Everything happened during a transfer to Tlalilco, though I don't remember the exact names of the stations. It was my first time in that labyrinth of endless tunnels, and I soon started to think I had taken the wrong path. The signs indicated I was going in the right direction, but the distance I walked seemed far too long for just switching lines. Moreover, the place was almost deserted, which made sense since it was nighttime. There was only one person ahead of me, about 30 meters away. He appeared to be a tall man with very short hair, dressed in clothes reminiscent of a typical office worker. I decided to quicken my pace to catch up to him. As I got closer, just a few meters behind, I announced my presence to avoid startling him. "Excuse me." He stopped, and so did I. When he turned to face me, I was overcome with a terror I still can't describe. At that moment, I was about to ask if I was heading in the right direction, but what I saw left me speechless. The man had no face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, or any features at all, just a smooth surface, like formless flesh. The shock made me fall backward. Instinctively, I covered my face with my hands, closed my eyes, and tried to regain my composure. When I finally opened my eyes, he was no longer there. I looked ahead, behind me, in all directions, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air, even though there were no doors or exits nearby. While I was trying to understand what had just happened, I noticed two people approaching from the distance, and an older man coming up behind me. "What happened, young man? Are you all right?" he asked. I said yes, but my confusion was evident. I kept looking for signs of the faceless man. Then, unexpectedly, the older man said something that unsettled me even more. "Has anyone ever told you not to talk to someone you only see from behind around here? And if you notice they're alone, it's better to wait for someone else to show up before walking with them. Sometimes things can get complicated." Those words scared me, but at the same time gave me a strange sense of validation. I hadn't told anyone about what I had seen, yet this man seemed to understand something I couldn't explain. He walked with me through the tunnel, talking about his family and work, as if trying to distract or calm me. When we went our separate ways, he emphasized, "Don't forget what I told you, all right?" I sincerely thanked him. At that moment, his company and words made a huge difference. In the days that followed, I sought professional help. I went to therapy, underwent neurological tests, anything that could shed light on what had happened. The results showed nothing out of the ordinary. My health was perfect. That's why I know what I saw that day wasn't the product of hallucinations or physical issues. Good evening. Before I start sharing my story, let me make one thing clear. I don't want my name to be revealed because I know many people will find this hard to believe. Thankfully, it was the only time I ever experienced something like this. I have been working for 13 years at a specialized hospital here in Veracruz, Mexico. I'm a doctor. Before securing my permanent position in 2015, I spent some time working in the emergency department, and it was there that this happened. Anyone who works in this field knows it's common to deal with extreme situations, severe accidents, unforgettable cases. But nothing prepared me for what I experienced that night. It was close to the end of my shift, around 4 in the morning. My shift was supposed to end at 6. Suddenly, a family came rushing in, a couple in their 40s or so, bringing a 10-year-old boy. They were in a panic because the boy had deep wounds on both arms. They had improvised with shirts and blood-stained cloths to try and stop the bleeding. We immediately took the boy in for treatment. Fortunately, he didn't seem to be in critical condition. He hadn't lost too much blood yet. While my colleagues talked to the parents, another doctor and I examined the boy. The wounds were recent, but they didn't look like typical cuts from a knife or glass. Forgive the graphic details, but it seemed as if chunks of flesh had been torn out in a way we couldn't explain. It wasn't something he could have done to himself, nor with a common object. It was as if the flesh had been violently ripped away. The boy was very restless. He didn't say a word or make eye contact. His pupils were extremely dilated. You could barely see the whites of his eyes. He kept trying to get up, as if he wanted to escape. We needed him to stay still to treat the wounds, but we couldn't control him. My colleague went to talk to the parents to find out if he had ingested anything. They swore he hadn't. We decided to sedate him, using a strong dose. After sedating him, we were able to clean and suture the wounds. We called the parents in to try to understand what had happened. A few minutes later, while we were still in the treatment room, we heard a noise coming from the stretcher. When we looked over, something unbelievable was happening. The boy, with his eyes closed, began pulling at the stitches with one of his hands, smiling. He was supposed to remain under the effects of the sedative for much longer. The wound reopened. My colleague and I rushed to restrain him, yelling for the parents to leave the room. It was chaos. He kept smiling. It wasn't a loud laugh. The sound had stopped, but the smile stayed there, frozen on his face. It was a terrifying scene, impossible to forget. I'm from Alto Hospicio, Chile, but I prefer not to reveal my name. After watching some videos about funeral homes and wakes, I realized, thanks to the stories, that what happened to my family and me, as absurd as it may seem, wasn't unique. In 2001, I lost a cousin, the son of one of my paternal aunts. He was only 5 years old when he suffered a road accident that resulted in head trauma. A few days later, he didn't make it. The wake was held at my grandmother's house, located in a remote neighborhood of Alto Hospicio. Just a few steps beyond the last houses and streets, you would encounter hills covered in sand, dry earth, and vast emptiness. I was 14 at the time, so I remember every detail clearly, the conversations and comments circulating. The coffin was brought to my grandmother's house in the afternoon, where the family gathered to mourn. The next day we would take him to the cemetery, following the necessary rites. The afternoon passed without major events. As evening fell, acquaintances arrived to offer their condolences while we had dinner. The small closed coffin was placed on a stand in the backyard. At that time, the property was marked only by a simple low fence that defined the boundary, but offered little protection. Even so, people respected property lines and security was rarely an issue. Later, a noise from the kitchen made us rush inside the house. The sound of breaking glass alarmed us. By then, there weren't many people left, so we went to see what had happened. We discovered that one of my aunts had knocked over a glass container. We helped clean up the mess and, after resolving the situation, returned to the backyard. It was at that moment we realized that, in the commotion, we had left the children of the family alone near the coffin, without any adults around. My aunts ran ahead while I finished picking up the shards. When I finally went outside, I found everyone standing silently. My aunts were holding the little ones in their arms, trying to comfort them. The children were terrified, pale, trembling, unable to utter coherent words. They tried to speak, but only disconnected sounds came out of their mouths. Finally, the eldest cousin, who was about 8 years old at the time, managed to explain, still shaken. I just looked, not knowing what to do. He ran out of the coffin, my cousin, and went with a man who was waiting for him across the street, heading toward the sandy hills. Hearing this, my aunts, including the mother of the deceased boy, insisted that it was impossible, that he had already passed away, that he was now in heaven. However, the other children began crying and confirmed, sobbing that they had seen their cousin running out, hand in hand with a man who had been waiting for him. They headed toward the darkness, where there was nothing but sandy hills and vast emptiness for miles. One of my aunts, shaken by what she had heard, decided to open the coffin, shielding the children from seeing its interior. But her reaction was heartbreaking. Screaming and shedding uncontrollable tears, she collapsed to the ground, clutching the lid and saying he wasn't there. Her son was no longer in the coffin. Panic spread among everyone. Other aunts rushed to confirm what she was saying, and the atmosphere, already heavy, became unbearable. I saw adults running back and forth, including my uncles and grandmother, as they called the police. Most of them kept asking the children what had happened, trying to understand who could have taken the boy. But all the children could say, still crying, was that he had run off with the man crossing the street toward the dunes. They added something I never understood. They said that as my cousin ran, he looked very ugly. No one ever explained to me what that meant. When the police arrived, they investigated the case, but I found out years later that they found no evidence. There were no footprints in the sand, no sign of my cousin's body. Despite this, the strangest part was that my younger cousins, separated from one another, gave identical statements. They even made drawings for the investigators. All of them depicted the same thing: a man waiting for the deceased boy and him leaving the coffin. My cousin's parents disappeared after all this. We never heard from them again. We weren't very close before, but after that episode, the silence became absolute. My family never spoke about it again. For over 3 years, I lived in a housing complex called a vecindad, located in Santa Marta Catitla, Mexico. It was a spacious place with a shared central courtyard and houses lined up on both sides. In total, there were 6 residences. Mine was the third one, starting from the entrance heading toward the back. My routine was peaceful, with nothing out of the ordinary happening. I spent most of my time away from home due to work, so I didn't have much interaction with the neighbors. I only knew Mr. Vicente, an elderly man who lived next door, and a family composed of a mother, father, and a little boy in the first house. In the second house lived a young man around my age, while the last 2 houses were almost always changing tenants. Until one night I was awakened by a scream that echoed through the courtyard of the complex. It was a female voice, anguished, and it made me jump out of bed. I turned on the light, put on my shoes, and noticed that Mr. Vicente was already outside. He was talking to a young woman, the tenant of the last house, who seemed completely out of control. She was clutching his arms tightly, visibly shaken, while he tried to understand what had happened. "Calm down, girl. What is it? Is there someone inside?" The young woman, with a pale face and trembling hands, could barely speak. She couldn't have been older than her early 20s, and she was terrified. Between stammers, she said she had seen an old woman hanging from the ceiling with a rope. That sent chills through me. The way she was panicking made it clear that this was no invention. Mr. Vicente, concerned, asked if she had any family members who could come get her so she wouldn't have to spend the night in the house after such a shock. I offered my house for her to rest, but he thought it would be better for her to go somewhere safer. The young woman called her boyfriend, and while she waited, she stayed with the mother from the family in the first house, near the entrance of the complex. Shortly afterward, the father of the family arrived, curious about what had happened. That's when Mr. Vicente, visibly irritated, vented, "It's that old wooden beam in the ceiling. I always tell the landlord to remove it, but he ignores me. Says it's nonsense and that it's part of the original structure. But why then does no one stay in those last houses for long?" He asked the young woman if we could take a look at the place before she left, and she agreed. The 3 of us went inside and headed to the room where she said she had seen the scene. Mr. Vicente pointed to a beam at the top, above the bed. It was a dark piece of wood, very old-looking, different from the rest of the construction. "See that? That's the one. The landlord insists on keeping it, claiming it respects the old architecture. But before this place became a complex, It had another function. And do you know what happened here? An old woman hanged herself on that exact beam about 20 years ago, even before I came to live here. He went on as if venting. This isn't the first time someone has seen something in that room. I asked the landlord why no one stays long in those houses, but he pretends nothing is happening. And these poor people, they're not to blame, right? Now imagine seeing that this girl will never want to stay here again. I can't even imagine something so horrible. That old beam, the story Mr. Vicente told, just thinking about it gave me chills. And it all happened so recently. I can't imagine the shock that young woman must have experienced. Mr. Vicente was right. We never saw her again. The next day I heard that someone came to pick up her belongings, and the house remained empty for the rest of the time I lived in the complex. I have no idea if the place is still standing today, but I remember it was near a well-known street where there was a large altar with a glass case for St. Jude Thaddeus, right on a nearby corner. My name is Teresa, and today I want to share an episode from my life with you. I should start by saying that in my family, supernatural events are almost non-existent. Despite this, we've always had a curiosity about the topic. Since I was a child, I've enjoyed listening to and telling stories, exchanging ideas with neighbors, friends, or anyone who had something interesting to say. But until then, nothing extraordinary had ever happened to us. It was while listening to shows about these subjects that I found your channel, Dom, and decided to share the only, and hopefully last, paranormal event we ever experienced. At the time I was 16 years old. I'm from Tonalá, Mexico. It was 2010, and on a random afternoon after school, two friends and I headed together to Parque Esperanza, which was on the way home. We would cross the park and then each of us would go our separate ways. At the entrance, near some steps diagonally across from an Electra store, we saw an old woman sitting on the ground with a cloth spread out, full of things for sale. We decided to stop and take a look. She had really cheap items, makeup, hair ties, and a turquoise hairbrush that caught my attention. It cost 5 pesos. Although it was a bit worn on the back, the bristles seemed fine and I decided to buy it. I already knew I'd wash it well before using it. When I got home and showed it to my mum, she found it odd. She was the one who noticed the very fine hairs tangled in the bristles. But I, being a typical teenager, didn't think much of it. What really attracted me was the color and design. I washed the brush with soap and water, removed the hairs, but eventually decided I might not even use it. For me, it was more decorative. A few days later, on a Saturday morning, I was alone in the living room. My parents had gone out to buy something for lunch, when I heard a sound coming from my room. It sounded like someone repeatedly running their fingers through the bristles of the brush. I got up and went to check. As soon as I entered, the sound stopped. I saw the brush on the bed, which was strange because I never left it there. It was always on the dresser. I looked around searching for an insect or some other explanation but found nothing. I put the brush back in its place and returned to the living room. When my parents returned, I didn't mention anything, but sometime later my mom told me something similar. She was alone in her room and heard the same sound, fingers sliding across the bristles of the brush. She thought I was already home, but when she checked, there was no one in my room. To make things worse, the brush was on a piece of furniture next to my bed, even though it should have been on the dresser where I kept it as a decoration. That's when I started to believe something was wrong with that brush, though I didn't want to scare my mom by talking about it. I was still trying to convince myself that there was a logical explanation. A couple of days later at night, I was sleeping alone in my room with the door locked, a detail I must mention to show that no one could have entered, when I woke up abruptly. I thought I had heard a sound inside the room. I stayed lying on my side, my back to the rest of the room, including the dresser where I usually kept the brush. Since the noise didn't repeat, I closed my eyes, trying to relax. That's when I heard it again, right next to my ear, the same sound of fingers sliding through the bristles of the brush. My body reacted instinctively and I turned around quickly, gripped by panic. I sat up in bed, breathing heavily, and at that exact moment, I heard the sound of the brush falling to the floor. I turned on the bedside lamp, my heart racing, expecting to see my mom or dad there, but the room was empty. The only thing there was the brush on the floor, still moving slightly, as if it had just fallen. That same night, without thinking twice, I grabbed the brush and threw it out the window, which faced an empty lot next to our backyard. Luckily for me, nothing strange ever happened again after that. My name is Abel Guzman, and I want to share my experience. Like many others, my job requires me to use the subway late at night. Usually, I arrive at the station around 10 o'clock. My office is about 5 blocks away from the Panteones station, so it's the most practical way to get home, which is near the Nativitas station. On one of those nights, I was already seated in the train car, waiting for it to depart. The doors stayed open longer than usual, maybe a minute or a little more. I was reading a book and casually noticed an elderly woman sitting on the other side of the car. She was leaning forward with her hands resting on her knees, as if trying to see something further down. I didn't pay much attention until I heard, "Abel." I looked around, surprised. A female voice had clearly called my name, but the car was empty, except for me and that woman. I dismissed the possibility that it was her since she was leaning forward, her hair in a bun with her back turned to me. I went back to reading, but then again, "Abel, Abel." This time the voice came from her direction. I leaned slightly to get a better look, and there she was in the same position, completely still. I decided to stare at her. Still with her back to me, I heard her clearly say, "Yes, it's you. I see you've noticed me. Come closer." She moved slightly as she spoke, shifting her head and hands, but she never turned around. Her voice was completely unfamiliar to me, but the most unsettling part was when she added, "The other woman said that if you don't come, she will." At that moment, I started to think it might be a prank. However, the atmosphere grew even stranger when she began to walk backward. She moved slowly toward me without looking directly at me. I was overcome with terror. On impulse, I jumped up and ran to the door, praying it was still open. Fortunately, I managed to get out before it closed. I quickly stepped away and looked back into the car. There was no one inside. I have no idea who that woman was, how she knew my name, or why she moved like that. Since then, I only board cars with more passengers. I'd rather not find out what would have happened if she had reached me. My name is Christina, and I want to share an intriguing experience. I worked as a vice principal at a school in Rio Negro, a city here in Colombia, and I am going to narrate something I experienced. In fact, I wasn't the only one who witnessed it, but I am the one telling the story. It all happened in a small and peaceful school. The main building housed the classrooms, bathrooms, the principal's office, and a few other offices. A smaller, separate space served as a multi-purpose hall for small events, though in practice, it was mostly used as a storage area. One day, as I was heading to the parking lot, which was beyond the multi-purpose hall, with its windows to the right of the path, I heard noises, like someone was moving objects inside. Because I was descending, the angle didn't allow me to see inside through the windows. I decided to go back, knowing that at that moment only I and Lucia, the cleaning lady, remained at the school. I had said goodbye to her just a few minutes earlier in the administrative office. When I reached the glass door of the hall, I noticed the sounds had stopped. No one was in sight, but the door, which was normally locked, was just ajar, as Lucia was still on the premises. I walked in, calling out loudly to see if someone, perhaps a teacher, had stayed behind. The space was small, and it only took a glance to see it was empty. The only unusual detail that caught my attention was a figure leaning against the back wall. A life-size statue of Jesus Christ on the cross, completely black. Skin, hair, eyes, crown of thorns, and garments. It was the classic representation of Christ crucified, but its appearance gave me an indescribable sense of unease. Shortly after, Lucia appeared, drawn by my calls. "Senora Cristina, what's happening?" she asked as she entered, noticing my expression. When she saw the statue, she suddenly froze. "Where did that image come from?" I realized she was just as unsettled as I was, which in a way validated my reaction. Although I'm Catholic, that object felt deeply strange to me. I have no idea, Lucia. I heard noises in here and came back to see if anyone was still at the school. Then I saw this. Just a little while ago, Miss Immaculada and I came through here to leave some things, and there was nothing like this. Lucia, still shaken, replied, I don't know who could have brought it. Could it belong to a teacher? The principal isn't here today. But even so, why would they bring something like this? What if the parents think we're teaching religion to the children? She was right. The statue wasn't just unsettling, it could also cause misunderstandings. We decided it would be best to hide it. We tried to move it, but surprisingly, even combining our efforts, the statue didn't budge an inch. It seemed incredibly heavy, and we were afraid it might fall and hurt us. In the end, we covered the figure with tarps and piled some objects in front of it, so the children wouldn't see it or be at risk of an accident. That day, Lucia asked me to wait for her so we could leave together. After locking everything up, we left the school with the distinct feeling that something unusual had occurred. The next day, as soon as I arrived at the school, Lucia rushed to meet me, speaking in a low voice. Good morning, Chris. I went straight to the multipurpose hall today to see if any teacher came by so I could ask about that statue. But you won't believe it. The figure is uncovered. The tarp we placed over it yesterday is gone. It's not even on the floor, and I was the one who opened the hall this morning. I was surprised. Don't tell me. Could someone have broken in and stolen something? Is anything missing in there? No, everything's exactly as we left it yesterday. Even the chairs we stacked in front of the statue are in the same place. Only the tarp is gone. I decided to discreetly ask the teachers if the statue belonged to someone so it could be taken away. I went from classroom to classroom, but no one knew anything about it. Even when I mentioned that I would throw it away if no one claimed it, there was no response. Every time I described the statue, I saw the same expression of discomfort I had when I first saw it. Something about that image made us all feel uneasy when we got close to it. The principal was still not at the school. She had traveled to Medellin for an educational event and wasn't due back until Thursday. Coincidentally, that same day, we were scheduled for a quarterly meeting in the evening. It was usually a casual gathering with food, but it always took place at the school. That evening, 3 teachers, Lucia and I, were there discussing the statue. We decided to wait for the principal to see if she knew anything about it or what we should do with it, since no one claimed ownership and we didn't know how to remove it. During the conversation, one of the teachers mentioned she hadn't yet seen the statue. So, we decided to take her to the hall. I confess we felt a bit apprehensive. It was nighttime and the school was dark, but we needed to clarify the matter. The teacher, Lucia, who had the key, and I went to the hall. The others stayed in the meeting room setting up tables. When we opened the hall and turned on the lights, we noticed something inexplicable. The cross was exactly where it had always been, but the figure of Jesus Christ had disappeared. We approached, moving the chairs and benches we had piled in front, thinking the statue might have fallen. We planned to pick up the pieces, but there was nothing. No sign of it anywhere in the hall. Frightened, we quickly returned to the meeting room. We were so shaken we could barely speak. The teacher who accompanied us thought we were joking with her, but our evident nervousness proved otherwise. When we arrived at the meeting room, we found the principal had just arrived. She seemed furious, throwing her things down while muttering irritably. One of the teachers asked what had happened, and the answer was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I didn't need to see what she saw to feel the impact of her words. The principal, visibly upset, began to explain what had happened shortly before she arrived. According to her, as she was driving, a man, completely out of control, ran across the street just meters from her car. She barely avoided hitting him. The car stopped mere centimeters from him, but the man didn't even glance her way. What left us in complete silence and changed the atmosphere of the meeting was her description of the man. She said he looked as if he'd been dipped in something like oil or tar, so dark was his body, and he wore clothes resembling those of men reenacting the Stations of the Cross, barefoot, shirtless, with a crown of thorns on his head. After nearly being hit, he ran toward the bushes without looking back. When we told her about the cross in the hall and what we had witnessed, the principal turned pale. We all went together to the hall and showed her the space. Everyone was shaken to see the empty spot where the statue had been. That night, no one dared stay at the school. We decided to end the meeting at a restaurant, avoiding the discomfort of staying in a place that now seemed weighed down by something we couldn't understand. The next day, after much discussion, we agreed it was best to get rid of the cross altogether. We called a garbage truck equipped with a small crane, the kind used to lift containers, to take it away. The workers arrived early, almost at the same time as Lucia, and quickly removed the object. Though we felt relieved after its removal, no one could explain how the cross had been brought there without anyone noticing, or what it truly was. We didn't know if what the principal saw that night was connected to the missing figure. To make it even stranger, it wasn't even close to Holy Week. It was September. Even so, we were all profoundly affected. We avoided the multi-purpose hall whenever possible, as if the place carried a shadow of that event. I never shared this openly with anyone, to avoid adding to the fear that already existed, but deep down I feared that whatever had come down from the cross might one day return. Good evening, everyone. My name is Blanca Perez, and I'm from Jalapa in the state of Veracruz, Mexico. I want to share with you an experience that, to this day, I still can't fully understand. I don't know exactly what we saw at that daycare or what was there with us. I took this job thinking it would be temporary, as I had other plans for my life. However, I ended up working at a daycare about 15 minutes from the city center. It was something I considered temporary, but I stayed there for more than 8 years. During that time, we experienced small strange incidents, but nothing compared to what happened about 5 years ago. At the daycare, we knew the children very well. They attended regularly, so it was easy to recognize each one of them. However, there was one day when everything changed. I arrived late for my shift because I had to resolve something at the clinic. With permission, I started my workday approximately 2 hours later than usual. When I arrived, the children were already engaged in their first activities, sitting at their desks in the classroom. I walked past them, observed the group, and greeted them. "Good morning, children. How are you all?" They responded in unison, as they always did, but among them there was one child I had never seen before. It didn't seem like a big deal since it was possible she was new, enrolled that very day. I assumed she was a newcomer. However, she didn't respond to me. She remained silent, her head down, staring at the desk. I noticed she didn't have a notebook or any school supplies, unlike the other children. I couldn't see her face well, but something told me I had never met her before. I decided I would check on her later. I left my things in the teacher's room and found Gloria, my colleague who would be working with me that day. Since it was a Tuesday, the director wasn't there. "Good morning, Gloria. How are you?" I asked. "And, hi, Blanca. I'm great. How about you?" "I'm fine, thank you. Hey, that new girl, she arrived today, right?" "What new girl, Blanca? We don't have any new children today." "Of course we do. There's a girl in the classroom I've never seen before. She doesn't have any supplies. Go take a look. Maybe you'll remember her." As we were leaving the teacher's room, we crossed paths with Mr. Elias, the daycare janitor. He was very well liked by everyone and showed up sporadically. The children loved having him around. He greeted us, but he seemed a bit unsettled. "Ladies, excuse me for asking, but who is that new girl at the daycare? I didn't know her. I'm sorry if I'm being rude, but she gave me quite a scare." My curiosity grew. I asked, "What happened, Mr. Elias? Why did she scare you?" "Well, that new girl you mentioned, Blanca. Did you see who brought her?" I hadn't even looked at the children closely today, but when I saw her, goodness, she gave me chills. "But what did she do to scare you?" "Nothing, and I feel bad about it. Maybe it's just my imagination, but her eyes. My God, those eyes." Hearing this, Gloria and I exchanged worried looks and decided to go to the classroom. When we entered, there she was, sitting and staring directly at us. To this day, it's the strangest feeling I've ever had looking at someone or something. That girl was pale with fine blonde hair and an extremely thin body, but her eyes, they didn't look human. They were disproportionately large, as if they didn't belong to a child, to a person. The way she watched us as we entered the room was unsettling. Her gaze seemed empty, expressionless. But those eyes, those eyes. My colleague pulled me into the hallway, and as I looked at her, I realized she felt the same. It was evident that the girl had noticed our reaction. We tried not to show it, as we didn't want her, whoever or whatever she was, to feel even more uncomfortable. But the feeling of fear was undeniable. At that moment, Mr. Elias approached us, noticing that we hadn't gotten a closer look at the girl yet. He suggested we call the director to confirm who this new child was. Judging by his expression, it was clear that he was also disturbed. We agreed with his suggestion and told him to make the call while we went back to speak with her and try to figure out who she was or who had brought her. Mr. Elias went to the office and we returned to the classroom. However, when we entered, the girl was no longer there. The strangest detail was that the only exit from that room was the door where we and Mr. Elias had been standing the entire time, at most for a minute or two. We hadn't seen anyone leave. We searched everywhere and asked the other children. We always had the habit of counting everyone at the beginning and throughout the day to ensure no one was left behind or lost. The children confidently stated that there were 14 of them. We counted, and indeed there were 14 children. We insisted, asking if they were sure no one else had been there earlier, but they denied it. None of the children had noticed or counted the girl. Shortly after, Mr. Elias returned. He told us he had spoken with the director, who confirmed that no new child had been registered that day. If we hadn't included her on the list ourselves, then no one else had done so either. Furthermore, Mr. Elias assured us he had searched the entire daycare but found no sign of her. Perhaps it was for the best, but since that day something changed. We never managed to explain what happened, but from then on, we always carried the fear that at some point she might appear again. Just the thought of possibly encountering that gaze, those disproportionately large eyes, was enough to make us uneasy. In my family, everything I'm about to share here was seen as a huge affront at the time. Even today, it's a forbidden topic during meals or any family gathering. I only talk about it with my parents. Therefore, it's important to maintain anonymity. In part, I understand their point of view. You'll soon understand why. On the other hand, I disagree on certain aspects, but whenever I try to bring up the subject, they harshly criticize me. The most curious thing is that there's an irony in all of this, as you'll see. It all started in a way no one expected. I come from a small village located near Jalapa, Mexico. If I mentioned the name of the place, anyone from there could easily identify my family, as even though we no longer live there, most of my relatives still do. In this village, there was a very modest funeral home. Many years ago, we lost an uncle with whom we had a cordial relationship, but we weren't very close. We were informed that he had died in an accident in the village, but the details were never clear, not even to my parents. Only my grandmother, an aunt, and his wife knew the specifics. It may seem irrelevant, but what happened during the wake might shed some light on the situation. My uncle was being mourned in a small chapel at the edge of the village, part of the funeral home. During the afternoon, many people attended, but by night only close family members and 2 of his friends remained. The chapel was tiny, accommodating at most 10 to 12 people around the coffin, which was at the back of the room. At that moment, I remember we were all outside talking. I was 20 years old at the time and the youngest there. While listening to my parents and uncles talk, my grandmother stormed out of the chapel furious, something I had never seen before. She was complaining, saying it wasn't the time for jokes, and demanded to know who had done it. My uncles approached her, surprised. "Mom, what happened? What are you talking about?" She replied angrily, accusing them of pretending ignorance and asking who was responsible. Everyone exchanged confused glances. That's when my grandmother ordered them to go to the coffin. It was an open casket wake. My uncle, who was completely bald, was now wearing a long blonde wig, clearly feminine. We were all stunned. None of those present, not my uncles nor his friends, would have done something like that, especially during such a delicate moment. Moreover, there was no way someone could have entered the chapel without us noticing. The space had no windows, just a single door, the very one where we were gathered. Only a few seconds passed between my grandmother leaving the chapel and us seeing the scene. While we were in shock, we heard hurried footsteps inside the chapel as if someone wearing high heels was walking. When we looked inside, the sound stopped. My grandmother was about to faint and had to be held up. The most disturbing part was when we looked back at the coffin. My uncle was sitting up, staring directly at us. The chapel was so small that we could all clearly see my uncle's eyes, covered with cotton. They were open, but lifeless, just the cotton filling the void. He seemed to be watching us with a serious expression. That moment was terrifying. My grandmother was crying desperately while my uncles tried to calm her down, incredulously asking who could have done that and how they could have entered or left. There was no explanation. My uncle, on the other hand, remained seated, motionless, looking at each one of us as if he were aware. Then the lights went out. The chapel was plunged into complete darkness. If I hadn't experienced it, I'd never believe it. It felt like a scene from a horror movie, but it was all real. During those few seconds of darkness, no one took their eyes off the room. When the lights came back on, my uncle was no longer sitting up. He was lying down again in the coffin, but with his feet hanging out. I didn't have the courage to go inside. My uncles did, however, while I stayed outside with my parents. My mother was silently crying, but we insisted on staying there, trying to understand what had happened. We even considered the possibility that someone from the funeral home might have been involved, but it made no sense. Why would they do something like that, especially at their workplace? Furthermore, there was no explanation for the high-heeled footsteps we had heard earlier. My uncle had sat up and stared at us, with eyes covered in cotton, and none of it made sense. We left the place with my grandmother, still without answers. To this day, no one knows what happened to the wig, but that hardly matters anymore. What remains is the mystery and the impact of that night. Over the years, my family distanced themselves from my uncle's relatives. It was a decision my parents made, and this event was one of the reasons we left the village. Much later, I was told what really happened. My uncle was a truck driver, and his death wasn't caused by an accident, as we were told at the time. He had taken his own life. The reason for this was something my parents only learned later, through a close friend of my uncle's, who also never showed up at the wake, which was strange in itself. This friend revealed that during his travels, my uncle had been involved with someone who worked at night and was transitioning genders. This information, in and of itself, wouldn't be relevant, but it helps clarify the context. According to the friend, my uncle had a history of encounters with this person, but had accumulated a significant debt and refused to pay. When threatened that the debt would be brought up in front of his family, he reacted violently, assaulting the person and leaving them critically injured by the roadside. Days later, he learned that they had died in the hospital. The friend, who didn't want to cover up the situation, said he would go to the police. My uncle became enraged, saying that the person got what they deserved and that he wouldn't take responsibility. The outcome was tragic, with my uncle taking his own life after realizing he no longer had control over the situation. My parents cut ties with the rest of the family because my grandmother and aunts already knew all of this and had hidden it. My uncle's friend also left the village. I mentioned the story about this person not to accuse or blame anyone, but to try to explain what happened that night at the wake. My parents believe that perhaps, in some way, this person came back to confront my uncle or to mock the family at that moment. I don't know if it was some sort of punishment or something else, but the events of that night remain inexplicable. I don't feel entitled to judge anyone. This was just the way we tried to make sense of what happened. Maybe it was something completely different, unrelated to the incident. I really don't know. This is my account, something that deeply marked me, both because of the terrifying image of that wake and everything surrounding the context. My name is Maria, and I want to share a story my grandmother, God rest her soul, used to tell us with great distress, from when we were children until just a few years ago. I even visited the house where it all happened, in El Salado, a small community here in Sinaloa, Mexico. It's a village on the road connecting Mazatlan to Culiacan, And back then, it was very different, with few residents and much emptier than it is today. Almost everything was made up of ranches and simple houses, as was common in the region. My grandmother recounted that while my mother and uncles were working or at school, and my grandfather was busy at work, she would stay home alone. One afternoon, while she was by herself, she heard someone knocking on the door, followed by shouting from outside. They were male voices insisting that she open the door. My grandmother, always very generous and unsuspecting, decided to answer. After all, in that region, everyone knew each other, and the custom was to trust one another since theft or malicious acts were rare. So, she quickly went to the door and opened it. Standing there were two young men who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. They looked so distressed they could barely speak. "What's wrong? Can I help you with something?" my grandmother asked, concerned. The young men, breathless, tried to say something, but their labored breathing made it hard for them to communicate properly. My grandmother asked if they would like to come in, have a glass of water, or if they needed help in any other way. That's when one of them, almost out of breath, finally said the problem wasn't just exhaustion from running. They were terrified. One of them said they didn't need to come in but would like some water and to make a phone call home. They explained that they were working on a construction site near the highway, and that, while they were handling the cement to pour it on the ground, something terrifying happened. 3 human hands emerged from the mixture. Whenever my grandmother told this part, she would often cry. She remembered how one of the young men broke down in tears while trying to explain what he had seen, as if the experience had taken all the air from his lungs. The other young man, speaking with an accent that seemed to be from another region of the country, also described the situation with a trembling voice. They said that the atmosphere at the worksite had been strange for days. Some co-workers had disappeared without a trace, and the rumor was that they had gone back to their home states, but no one was certain. Payments weren't arriving, and the environment was becoming increasingly heavy. Seeing those hands emerge from the cement was enough for them to understand that something terrible was going on. My grandmother insisted they come inside and use the phone, but they refused, saying they didn't want to bother her. She tried to convince them, explaining that the phone was inside the house, but it seemed like they were paralyzed by fear, unable to act. Even so, they accepted her offer of water. She went to the kitchen to fetch 2 glasses, leaving the door open. It didn't take more than a few seconds, but when she returned, the young men were gone. She looked around, but there was no one. At that time, the properties were vast and open with few places to hide, yet they had simply vanished. Over the years, my grandmother continued to tell this story with sadness. She always wondered if those young men were still alive or if somehow they had already passed when they appeared at her door. She prayed constantly for them, hoping that wherever they were, they had managed to reunite with their families. I was born in Durango, Mexico, and I prefer not to reveal my real name. You can call me Afonso. On my street back in San Juan del Rio, Durango, people would probably recognize who I am if I revealed my identity. But I want to keep it a secret because my relatives on my father's side still live there. As I tell this story, it will become clear why I wish to remain anonymous. It's a delicate and peculiar account. I witnessed most of the events when I was 12 years old, in the year 2000. At the time, I lived with my parents on a street where my grandparents lived just a few meters away, about 2 blocks from us. They're still there. I used to play with friends of the same age group. We'd play soccer in the street, ride our bikes, or just hang out and talk. There were 5 of us in total. There was one boy in particular that I'll never forget. I'll call him Kaique. He was 10 years old, the youngest in his family, and a very generous person. His family consisted of an older brother, around 17 or 18, and his mother. I vaguely remember seeing his father, but he disappeared a long time ago. None of us ever asked Kaique about it. Kaique didn't like staying at home. He said the place scared him. It wasn't something that had always been the case, but for quite some time he'd felt that way. Still, he remained a cheerful and laid-back kid. But as evening approached and it was time to go home, Kaique would become visibly nervous. He'd ask us to stay with him a bit longer because he didn't want to go back. One of those times I stayed with him and another friend while the others had to leave. We asked him why the house scared him and what was happening there. That's when he started to explain. He said that both during the day and at night, people would appear. People he and his family didn't know. These people would say mean things to them. He mentioned that children, teenagers his brother's age, and adults his mother's age would walk through the house and insult him. Then, suddenly, they'd disappear as if they were never there. Kaik was so terrified that even being in the same room as his mother didn't help him sleep. He could clearly see these people who appeared out of nowhere, and they all seemed to have something to say to his mother. They would appear coming from rooms like the bedrooms, the kitchen, the yard, or the bathroom. But they never opened any doors. They would simply walk through them. Since he was always close to his mother, Kaik ended up seeing everything. His mother would just tell him to pray constantly, though she herself would cry a lot. Hearing this at that age was unsettling for me. I didn't know many scary stories, just the traditional ones like La Llorona or El Viejo del Saco. I asked, intrigued, what else happened. Kaik said that the house would move. Those were his words. We thought he was joking and asked if the house literally walked. He explained that it didn't, but the furniture would shake, knock into each other, and drawers would open and close on their own. Sometimes doors would lock by themselves, trapping them in rooms or bathrooms, only unlocking after a while. Once Kaik felt something like a slight tremor, as if it were a small earthquake. He thought that might be why his brother rarely stayed at home. His mother, according to him, was always exhausted. She worked during the day, and when she came home she'd sleep, cook dinner, and then go back to sleep. Kaik said she took medication to sleep deeply. Because of this, he spent most of his time outside playing in the street. He told us all of this himself. Another thing we knew, because my parents always warned me to be careful, was that Kaik's brother had serious problems because he hung out with people involved with dangerous substances. It seemed like something big. Kaik also said that sometimes his brother would disappear for days, and when he came back he barely stayed at home. He also saw those people who appeared out of nowhere. But despite that, the three of them, Kaik, his brother, and his mother, seemed to get along. It wasn't due to fights or arguments that his brother avoided the house. After he told us all of this, Kaike's mother called him in for dinner. He thanked us for staying with him while she woke up to prepare the meal. We didn't talk about it again for about 2 weeks. We kept playing in the street as usual until one night my mother came home and told my father and me that Kaike's brother had been found lifeless in an abandoned house near where we lived, with a rope hanging from the ceiling. I'm sure you understand what happened. That night no one left their homes. The next day I noticed Kaik's house was empty. There was no talk of a wake or anything like that. 2 days later, we saw Kaik's mother's car parked in front of their house. My parents thought it was best to wait a bit before offering their condolences, asking me not to bother them for the time being. On the third day at noon, we saw firefighters and ambulances arriving. Kaik's house was on fire. From a distance, we watched as they tried to put out the flames. It was a small house and it was completely destroyed. Outside, Kaik and his mother were hugging each other, crying as they spoke to police officers and paramedics. After that, they were taken away, I assume for assistance. That was the last day we saw them. They never came back. The house was reduced to rubble with nothing salvageable. We didn't know where they went or who they were with. Years passed. Before we left San Juan, I asked my parents what might have happened to Kaike's family. My father told me something unexpected. Your mother and I knew Kaik's parents had serious problems for a long time. Do you remember his father? Well, he used to do strange things, involving rituals and spirits. Kaik's mother herself told us that when they separated, his father left the house saying he had cursed it. He claimed he had given the house and the family as payment. But not to a bank or someone we know. He said it was to you-know-who. In exchange, he wanted luck in life, as long as it kept him away from them. We never knew if what happened was related to that, but the family always seemed exhausted and worn out. Their lives changed drastically and tragically ended in a terrible way. We have no idea how or where they are now. My name is Miguel. I'm from Buenaventura, Colombia, and I want to share my story. When I was around 12 or 13 years old, I remember seeing my mother crying at my grandmother's house. It wasn't something I fully understood, but I could tell she left there deeply hurt. They always sent me away when the adults were talking, so I would hide and listen to her sobs. I never managed to catch exactly what they were saying, but it was clear their words wounded her deeply. At 14, I still didn't understand what was going on in that house. My mother seemed distressed when talking to my grandmother and my aunts, but no one included me in those conversations. When I asked, my mother downplayed it, saying it was just adult issues and that she wasn't crying. My father dismissed my concerns as well, saying it was just disagreements that would be resolved with time. After I turned 14, something changed. We stopped visiting my grandmother's house, and some relatives started coming to our house instead. My parents said my grandmother's house was under renovation, and my sister and I didn't question it. A few years later, during high school, I started leaving home very early to study, around 5 in the morning. It was on one of those mornings that my life changed forever. When I returned home, I found a chaotic scene. Many family members crying, hugging me, and offering words of comfort. My sister wasn't there, but my father broke the news to me my mother had passed away. At that moment, everything stopped. It was the late 1980s, and without cell phones, news took time to spread. By the time I got back, my mother's body had already been taken away. She had passed away early that morning while she was sleeping. They said they called an ambulance, but no one could explain what had happened. My mother, only 47 years old, had no known health issues. There were no answers, only silence. Those were difficult times, full of uncertainties. A few years later, one of my aunts gathered me, my sister, and my father for a conversation. With my father's permission, she began, "I want to explain something to you. Your father has always known about this, but we decided not to tell you earlier because you were too young, and because we ourselves didn't fully understand." My father simply nodded as my aunt continued. "It all started when your mother told us, at your grandmother's house, that she had run into her sister, one of your mother's aunts, on the street. It was an ordinary day, and she was coming back from the store. You never met this woman because she always had conflicts with the family. She was a very problematic person." My aunt paused before continuing. "Your mother tried to be polite, as was her nature, but the aunt started saying horrible things. She said your mother was going to die, that she should watch out, and she even threatened that if they met again, she would do something terrible. Your mother was confused, but said goodbye and left." She paused again, perhaps searching for the right words to explain. "The problem was that your mother only told us about this after she saw her again. This time it happened near our house. She was taking care of something on the street and saw the aunt standing on the sidewalk with the same angry look. Even so, your mother, always so kind, tried to greet her. The response was the same, full of threats and hatred. The aunt said she knew almost everything about her life and that something bad was going to happen." My aunt finished her story while my father remained silent. At that moment, I realized there was much more behind my mother's tears than I could have imagined. That afternoon, when your mother told us about the time she saw the aunt, your grandmother replied that she shouldn't worry, claiming that the aunt was unbalanced and bitter about the choices she had made in life. We, your mother's sisters, were left speechless. But whenever you saw your mother crying or overheard her confiding in us, it was because, terrified, she said she kept seeing that aunt getting closer and closer to the house where we lived. My aunt went on. At first she would appear on streets a bit farther away, then closer, until one day she showed up at the corner. She always said terrible things. Your mother cried a lot because we didn't believe her. We thought it was impossible for her to have seen this woman since she had passed away months before the first encounter your mother described. Your mother grew frustrated, feeling disbelieved, and indeed we didn't believe her. We thought it was just fear or her imagination. Only your father and I took her seriously because we knew your mother had no idea that this aunt was already dead. One time, your mother told us in tears that she saw the woman on the street where we lived. From there, the aunt shouted, "Let's see if this makes your grandmother stop laughing like a fool." Your mother had already given up trying to convince us because she knew no one except your father and me believed her. That's when we decided to stop visiting your grandmother's house. She didn't want to talk about it anymore. tired of not being taken seriously. Even so, she confided in me that she saw the aunt for the last time, spying through the window of this house. Just 1 week after that, your mother was gone. My aunt paused and concluded, "We never truly understood what happened. None of us ever saw this woman. We don't understand why your grandmother and the other aunts didn't believe her, or why she appeared only to your mother. The only thing we know for sure is that what your mother said came true. That woman in some way found us. Your grandmother never smiled the same way again after the day your mother left us." My name is Yolanda Herrera, and I come from the vibrant Mexico City. For as long as I can remember, our home has always been in San Francisco, Culhuacan. I know every corner of the neighborhood, every curve of its streets. It was only in 2019, when news of that disease that kept us indoors for so long began to emerge, that at 19 years old, I got a job at a stationery store on Santa Ana Avenue. I would leave work around 9 at night, and the walk home was about 15 or 20 minutes. Having lived there my entire life, I never felt much fear walking alone at night. To get home, I would walk up Ejido Street and follow it for 6 or 7 blocks. Although I felt comfortable, there were moments when walking there caused slight discomfort, mainly because of some dark alleys. That night, as I passed by a small grocery store that was already closed, I turned my head, almost instinctively, and felt like I saw something unusual. That's when I noticed at the top of a wall taller than me, with an even higher fence surrounded by barbed wire, a woman sitting there. With her back to me, she seemed to be watching the path I was about to take. It didn't make sense how she was balanced there on the wire. I kept walking down the street completely alone. Although the sound of voices from houses and TVs filled the air, there was no one else on the sidewalks. As I got closer to that wall, I kept looking at her, unable to look away, incredulous at what I was seeing. Then she turned her face toward me, and her face made me uncomfortable. She seemed young, but something was off. It was as if her face was a mix of youth and old age, with features that resembled a witch's mask, but they were clearly real. When she looked at me, she smiled, her face wrinkled with the movement, making everything even stranger. At that moment, a neighbor, an older man who always greeted me during the day and owned a business nearby, shouted, "Nadia, come here right now!" His tone was firm, almost as if he were scolding me. I obeyed, quickening my steps and looking away from the woman. As I moved away, I heard a low laugh that seemed to come from her. When I got close to the neighbor, he placed his hand on my back, preventing me from looking back, and asked, "Are you okay?" I said yes, but I was confused. Why had he pulled me like that? Before I could ask, he explained something that left me speechless. "Kid, don't walk through here so late, at least not these days. You saw the woman, didn't you? Well, she's been dead for 3 weeks, but we've seen her sitting on that wall. Not always, but tonight, unfortunately, you crossed paths with her. No one understands what this means." He insisted on walking me home. I knew his family well, his wife and his eldest son, who was a bit older than me. I didn't know what to say. We walked in silence for a block as I tried to process what I had just heard. When we arrived, he asked to speak with my father, with whom he was good friends. I thanked him for accompanying me, still unable to believe what had happened. I have no idea what they talked about, but shortly after, my father came to me, asked if I was okay, and quickly changed the conversation to topics like my job, my routine, everyday things. Fortunately, I never saw her again. I started leaving work earlier and did everything I could to avoid being late. Since there weren't many route options, I preferred not to take any risks. However, that image of the woman has never left my mind. Good evening, Dom. I am Pedro Angel from Michoacan, Mexico. If there is something in my life that has deeply marked me, it wasn't at the moment it happened, but years later when I began to understand what previously made no sense. I need someone to tell me if what I think is correct, or at least close to the truth. First of all, let me explain. I was born in Tachicuaro, a small locality in Morelia. I spent my childhood and adolescence there before we moved away. The place has always been small, with few residents. The last time I visited, a few years ago, I noticed how some parts seemed deserted, almost abandoned. When I was a child, I used to play in the streets with my cousins. It was the early 90s. Back then, everything was calm, with little activity and no significant dangers. One afternoon, one of my cousins, there were 3 of us, I was 10 years old, one was 8, and the other 11, suggested we go to the cemetery. It was a small cemetery, a bit removed from the main streets. We got excited not because we wanted to hunt ghosts, but because we were curious, kids looking for something new. He said it seemed interesting, that maybe we'd find something fun. We agreed. We walked a few blocks to get there. There was an old man who took care of the cemetery. We knew him by sight, but had never gone inside. We only watched from a distance. He recognized us and asked if our parents knew where we were. My oldest cousin assured him they did and explained that we just wanted to see the place. The man warned us, "Be careful with the wells, stay on the path and don't touch anything. I'll be keeping an eye on you." The cemetery was small, so we started walking around, observing the graves, the decorations, and the names on the tombstones. We came up with the idea to split up and meet at the end of the cemetery to share what we had seen. I got excited and chose the path on the right. Another cousin went to the left, and the oldest went down the middle. I walked for a few minutes down that narrow path, not feeling anything special, until suddenly I felt something strange. It was as if someone was watching me. Worse, it felt like something was forcing my head to turn. It was weird, like invisible hands were gripping my face and making me look to the side. What I'm about to tell you reflects the innocence of a child who doesn't recognize danger. I looked at the ground and saw an open grave, abandoned, without a tombstone. Inside that hole, what caught my attention was something my child's mind identified as a balloon. An enormous balloon, maybe the size of a washing machine, perfectly round. At the center of this balloon, there was the clear image of a complete eye, but with 2 small eyes next to it, all fixed on me. At that moment, I thought it was just a balloon with a strange design, something I had never seen before. I was fascinated. I noticed the balloon was floating inside the grave, where the sunlight still illuminated the bottom. I was sure that big eye was staring at me. I ran away, not out of fear, but excited to tell my cousins what I had found. As I moved away, I realized the eye was following my movements. When I got to the meeting point, they were already there. I told them what I had seen, excited they wanted to see it too, and quickly followed me. We ran to the grave, but there was nothing there. The place was empty. My youngest cousin suggested we look for the balloon, thinking it might have floated somewhere else. We went along with the idea and started searching. Meanwhile, my oldest cousin went to talk to the caretaker to ask if anyone had brought balloons to the cemetery. The man denied it, explaining that it had been a long time since anyone had brought balloons there. He even mentioned that he preferred they didn't, to avoid problems, like loose balloons getting tangled in electrical wires. So that day there were no balloons. We left the cemetery and said goodbye to the caretaker. My cousins, frustrated that they hadn't seen anything, often asked me to retell what I had seen. And I, excited to be the only one who had witnessed it, described everything in detail. The years passed. We moved to another city, but that scene never left my mind. Over time, however, the feeling it brought changed. If before I felt excitement when remembering, now I feel fear. After all, what was that? A balloon with that strange design doesn't make sense. I've never seen anything like it again. And if it wasn't a balloon, what else could it have been? Leave your opinion in the comments. Before we get to the last story, if you're still here, let me know what time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing who sticks around until the end. Let's not stop now. On to the next. I prefer to keep my name a secret. I know well that many won't believe the story I'm about to tell. Some will think it's just made up, something that never happened. And honestly, I understand. If I could, I'd choose for it never to have happened. I didn't experience this directly, but I learned about it and witnessed what followed, which was even stranger. I don't want to get ahead of myself, so I'll start from the beginning. The day my aunt took my two cousins to a fair. It was a fair set up in the town where we grew up, San Andres Tuxtla in Veracruz. At that time I was already 14, and to be honest, fairs didn't excite me much. My mom even suggested I go with them, but I refused. I preferred to do something else. Later, when they returned to my grandparents' house, where we gathered on weekends, my aunt and my cousins, she had an 8-year-old girl and a 10-year-old boy, came back excited, talking about the day's adventures. They said the fair had been set up at the Primero de Mayo sports field, just like in the old days. They went on rides, enjoyed booths with games like marbles and fishing with little nets. My cousin even showed me something peculiar, a mark on his shoulder. It was a small bite, like one from a child his age. He laughed as he explained how it happened. While they were walking through the booths, they saw an old man sitting in a shoeshine chair. On his lap was a ventriloquist's dummy. As they approached, the man started interacting with them, using the dummy to put on a little show. My cousin, finding the dummy curious, reached out to touch it. That's when the dummy moved quickly and bit his shoulder. He said it didn't hurt, but it startled him. Everyone ended up laughing, including the old man, who jokingly pretended to scold the dummy. It seemed like part of the act, and so they left, amused by the incident. A few days passed before I heard from them again. That's when my mom mentioned that my cousin was very sick, with a high fever that wouldn't go down. They had already consulted doctors, but nothing seemed to help. My mom, who had some experience in healthcare, decided to visit him to see if she could assist. When she came back, she said the situation was worrisome. The doctor suspected an infection but couldn't identify its source. As the days went by, my mom revealed something even more unsettling. The bite on his shoulder, which had initially seemed superficial, just a small reddish mark, had turned into something serious. The skin around it was darkening, almost looking necrotic. What had started as an innocent joke had turned into something much scarier. During those days, my mom kept saying they still hadn't figured out what was wrong with my cousin. I didn't know if it was because they hadn't sought the right care or due to a lack of resources. But one thing was clear, she was very worried. I didn't see my cousin, my aunt, or my other cousin. They stopped coming to my grandmother's house, and the adults would whisper to each other occasionally, as if trying to keep us from overhearing. Everything happened so quickly. The little information I had came from my mum. She told me my cousin was getting worse and that the mark on his shoulder had started spreading up his arm and neck. She said he seemed weaker each day. And in one of the last tests they did, and I know this will sound strange, but it's what happened, they found bacteria in the bite mark. According to her, these bacteria were the type found in decomposing bodies. My mom explained that this wasn't something my cousin's body was producing, but rather something that somehow had been placed there. That's when my aunt remembered that day at the fair and the dummy that had bitten him. At the time it had seemed so insignificant. The dummy was wooden and hadn't even torn his shirt. But, well, when they decided to go back to the fairgrounds to try to understand, the fair was already gone and the field was empty. The last thing I heard was that they took my cousin to live in Catemaco. There they would try to treat him at another clinic and also seek help from specific places in the region, as it seemed like he was at risk of dying. Years passed and my mom kept in some contact with my aunt, even though Catemaco wasn't that far away. Still, I was never invited to visit them, nor did I hear about any plans for them to come here. Since we weren't that close, I would occasionally hear that he was a little better, but his health remained fragile. Over time, their contact dwindled. Today, all I know is that my cousin is still alive, but I have no idea how he's doing. And to this day, I can't believe that ventriloquist's dummy at the fair was the start of it all. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to stay updated on all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. I hope to see you in the next one. On the screen now, I'm leaving 2 other great videos I know you'll enjoy. See you there.